In the dusty town of Whisper Valley, Outlaws made the deadly mistake of mocking the wrong bartender. They couldn't have known that the quiet man polishing glasses had more notches on his gun than their entire gang combined, or that their cruel taunts would awaken a legend they thought long dead, the infamous Prairie Shadow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Silver Star Saloon, catching dust motes that danced in the amber light. Nate Hawkins methodically polished a glass with practiced precision, his movements as measured and quiet as the man himself. 5 years he'd been tending bar here, and in all that time, Emma Hawthorne had never seen him waste a single movement or speak an unnecessary word. "Nate, have you ever thought about taking a day off?" Emma asked, counting the night's earnings behind the bar. Her question earned her the slight upturn of his mouth that passed for a smile these days. "What would I do with a day off, Miss Emma?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, the kind of voice that made most folks lean in closer to hear. It was also the kind of voice that made them underestimate him, which suited Nate just fine. The saloon was quiet this afternoon, just old Walt Jenkins nursing his usual whiskey in the corner, and Doc Green reading his medical journal at his regular table. The doc glanced up occasionally, his eyes meeting Nate's in that knowing way they had. Of all the people in Whisper Valley, only Doc Green knew why Nate's hands, now so careful with the delicate glassware, had once been feared throughout the Arizona territory. The peaceful routine was interrupted by the jingle of spurs as Marshal McAllister pushed through the batwing doors, his weathered face creased with concern. "Afternoon, Emma." "Nate." He nodded to them both, then made his way to the bar. "Got word from Cedar Ridge. Blackwood gang's been spotted heading this way." Nate's hands didn't pause in their work, but something flickered in his eyes, a shadow so brief anyone else might have missed it. Emma didn't miss much, though. She'd been running the Silver Star long enough to read men better than most. "Red Jack Blackwood?" she asked, her voice dropping. "Thought he and his bunch stayed up north near the railroad." "Times change," McAllister sighed, accepting the coffee Nate silently placed before him. "They hit 3 banks in the last month. Latest word says they're moving south, probably looking for easier targets now that the railroad's beefed up security." Doc Green had set aside his journal, listening intently. "How many in his gang now, Bob?" 5 that we know of," the marshal replied. "Blackwood, Clay Thorne, the Reed twins, and that young hothead Lucas Reeves. Mean bunch. They don't just rob. They make a show of it. Like, to humiliate folks before they kill 'em." Nate's hands finally stilled on the glass he was polishing. For just a moment, his fingers traced an old scar on his right palm, a habit none of them had ever mentioned but all had noticed. "Whisper Valley's got nothing worth their trouble," Emma said firmly, as if speaking it would make it true. "They'll pass us by." "Maybe," McAllister agreed, but his eyes drifted to Nate. "Still, it might be wise to send word to Carson City, get some extra deputies out here, just in case." "Takes 3 days for help to arrive from Carson City," Nate spoke softly, resuming his work. "If they're coming, they'll be here sooner than that." The marshal studied him for a long moment. "You seem mighty sure about that, Nate." "Just arithmetic, Marshal. Nothing more." But his words carried a weight that made the room feel suddenly smaller. Old Walt chose that moment to stumble to his feet, fishing in his pockets for coins. "Reckon I better head home 'fore dark. The clouds rolling in look like rain." He nodded to Emma. "Put it on my tab, Miss Hawthorne?" "Just like always, Walt." She smiled, making a note in her ledger. As the old man shuffled out, Doc Green gathered his things as well. "Think I'll do the same. Nate, don't forget to pick up those medicines I ordered for your headaches. Came in on yesterday's stage." Nate nodded, though everyone in the room knew he hadn't suffered a headache in all the years they'd known him. It was just one of those little fictions they all maintained, like pretending not to notice how he always kept his right hand free when serving drinks, or how his eyes constantly scanned the room even when it was empty. As the afternoon deepened toward evening, Grace O'Malley appeared for her nightly performance, her red hair catching the last rays of sunlight as she sat up near the piano. Her voice, when she began to warm up, was sweet and clear, a touch of beauty in a town that often had too little of it. "Rider coming," Emma announced from her spot by the window. "Moving fast." Nate's hands remained steady as he arranged bottles on the shelf, but his stance shifted ever so slightly. To most, he still looked like nothing more than a simple bartender preparing for the evening rush. But Marshall McAllister saw how the man's weight had settled on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction. The sound of thundering hooves grew louder, then stopped abruptly outside the saloon. The batwing doors burst open, revealing a young ranch hand, his face flushed with exertion and fear. Marshall McAllister, they're coming. The Blackwood gang. They just shot up Cedar Ridge. Killed the sheriff and his deputies. They're headed this way." In the sudden silence that followed, Nate carefully set down the bottle he was holding. His movements were still measured, still precise, but now they carried an entirely different quality, like a mountain lion uncoiling before a leap. "How far?" McAllister demanded. 2 hours, maybe less. They're moving fast and— The ranch hand swallowed hard. "They're killing everyone in their path." Emma's hand went to her throat. "Mother of God." "Get word to everyone," McAllister ordered. "Tell them to bar their doors and windows. Nobody on the streets after dark." He turned to Emma. "Might want to close up early tonight." "No." Nate's quiet voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Keep the saloon open, just like any other night." They all turned to look at him, but his eyes were fixed on something distant, seeing perhaps not the bottle-lined shelves before him, but something from long ago. "Nate?" Emma's voice held a question. "Some folks need to learn," he said softly, "that the quietest rattler strikes the deepest." Evening crept into Whisper Valley like a thief, bringing with it an unseasonal chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The Silver Star Saloon maintained its usual appearance, but tension hung in the air as thick as tobacco smoke. Grace's usual song seemed more melancholy than ever, her voice carrying notes of warning that everyone felt but nobody mentioned. Marshall McAllister had positioned himself by the window, occasionally glancing down the darkening street. The few patrons who remained hunched over their drinks, speaking in whispers as if afraid their voices might carry beyond the saloon's walls. Even old Walt had sobered up enough to notice the change in atmosphere, his roomy eyes darting between the door and Nate's steady presence behind the bar. "2 riders coming in from the south," McAllister announced, his hand instinctively moving to his gun belt. The saloon fell silent, save for the soft clink of glasses as Nate continued his work. The riders turned out to be nothing more than traveling salesmen, seeking shelter for the night. But their news brought no comfort. "Passed through Cedar Ridge this morning," the older of the 2 men said, hands shaking slightly as he lifted his whiskey. "Never seen anything like it. They didn't just rob the bank, they made examples of anyone who looked at them wrong. Sheriff Tanner." He trailed off, taking another drink. "What about Sheriff Tanner?" Emma pressed, though her face suggested she didn't really want to know. "They made him watch while they shot his deputies. Then they tied him to his horse and—" The salesman couldn't finish. Doc Green, who had returned to the saloon despite the growing danger, spoke up from his corner. "How many dead?" "7 that I counted. Would have been more, but it seems they wanted to leave enough folks alive to spread the word about what happens when you stand up to the Blackwood gang." Nate's movements had slowed almost imperceptibly as he listened. To most, he appeared absorbed in his task of inventory, but Emma noticed how his right hand kept straying to a spot under the bar, where she knew a shotgun had hung unused for the past 5 years. The younger salesman, trying to lighten the mood, attempted a joke. "Lucky for us we've got a marshal here, right? Though I reckon even the law might want to think twice about facing Red Jack Blackwood. They say he's got 23 notches on his gun." A strange sound came from behind the bar, something between a scoff and a sigh. All eyes turned to Nate, who had paused in his work. "Something funny about that, bartender?" the young man asked, a slight edge to his voice. 23 notches, Nate said quietly, resuming his task. Man who needs to count that high isn't much of a gunfighter. The salesman's face reddened. What would you know about it? You're just a— That's enough, Emma cut in sharply. Nate, could you check the cellar? I think we're running low on that Kentucky bourbon. Nate nodded and moved toward the cellar door. As he passed Doc Green's table, the physician spoke in a voice only Nate could hear. Your old wound bothering you? Not yet, Nate replied softly. But it will be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Grace struck up another song, this one about a serpent in the garden, and Marshall McAllister moved to the bar. Emma, a word? He glanced around before continuing in a low voice. You should know. I sent a rider to Carson City, but even if they send help immediately, they won't get here in time, Emma finished. I know. She looked toward the cellar door. Bob, about Nate. Brr. The marshal warned. Some secrets are best left buried. But secrets, like corpses, had a way of rising to the surface. This became apparent when 3 local cowhands burst into the saloon, their faces pale with fear. Found Jimmy Carter's body out by Broken Spoke Creek, one of them reported breathlessly. Shot clean through the head, execution style. His horse was still saddled, hadn't been dead for more than an hour. The news hit the room like a physical blow. Jimmy Carter was just a kid, barely 17, who helped his uncle run the general store. They're closer than we thought, McAllister grimaced. Emma, maybe now's the time to— The sound of shattering glass cut through the air as the young salesman dropped his bottle. But it wasn't the noise that silenced the room. It was what followed. From somewhere in the darkness outside came the distant but unmistakable sound of gunfire, followed by screams. Nate emerged from the cellar, his face impossible to read. But there was something different about him now. Something in the way he moved, as if the quiet bartender was slowly falling away like an ill-fitting coat. Marshal, he said, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there before. You might want to get these folks home while they can still make it. McAllister studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, everyone out. Head straight home, bar your doors. He turned to Emma. You too. This is my saloon, she started to protest, but Nate interrupted. Please, Miss Emma, for once don't argue. Something in his tone made her pause. She'd never heard him speak that way before, like a man who knew exactly what was coming and had seen it all before. As the patrons hurriedly filed out, Doc Green lingered. Need any help? Best get your medical bag ready, Doc, Nate replied, beginning to move bottles from the top shelf to below the bar. Something tells me you'll need it before morning. The sound of distant gunfire came again, closer this time, accompanied by the wild whoop of men who had left their humanity somewhere in the dust of their trail. The Blackwood gang was coming, and with them, the end of peace in Whisper Valley. As Emma finally allowed herself to be led out by Marshall McAllister, she looked back at Nate. He stood behind his bar as he had countless times before, but now she saw what she'd been blind to all these years. The way he held himself, the deliberate precision of his movements, the watchful eyes that missed nothing. This wasn't just a man who had seen violence. This was a man who had once been violence himself. The Blackwood gang didn't so much enter Whisper Valley as they infected it. Their arrival brought a silence that swept through the streets like a prairie fire, extinguishing all signs of life. Only the Silver Star's lights remained bright, a beacon in the growing darkness. Nate heard them before he saw them, the synchronized rhythm of 5 horses moving at a deliberate pace. Not the hurried gallop of men running from the law, but the confident stride of predators who feared nothing in their path. He kept wiping the same glass, his movements unchanged, as the sound of boots and spurs grew louder on the wooden sidewalk outside. The batwing doors exploded inward with unnecessary force. Jackson, Red Jack Blackwood entered first, a tall man with flame-red hair and a scarlet bandana at his throat. His duster was expensive, but spattered with dark stains that wouldn't wash out. Behind him came Clay Thorne, lean and snake-like, followed by the Reed twins. So similar in appearance they seemed to be reflections of each other. Young Lucas Reeves brought up the rear, practically bouncing with poorly contained energy. "Well, ain't this cozy?" Blackwood's voice carried the hint of educated roots gone to seed. "Seems most establishments in this charming town decided to close early. How hospitable of you to stay open for weary travelers." Nate set down his glass with careful precision. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" "Gentlemen?" Thorne laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Hear that, Jack? He called us gentlemen." "Your best whiskey," Blackwood ordered, dropping into a chair and propping his boots on the table. "Leave the bottle." Nate reached for the top shelf, his movements measured and deliberate. He could feel their eyes on him, 5 sets of them, watching for any sign of fear or resistance. He gave them neither. "You boys aren't from around here," Nate observed quietly, placing the bottle and glasses on their table. What gave it away? Samuel Reed, or perhaps it was Daniel, grinned. "Our refined manners? The way you carry your guns," Nate replied, turning back toward the bar. "Low on the hip, railroad style. Nobody out here draws from that position." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem to know a lot about guns for a bartender," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "Man learns things." Nate shrugged, resuming his endless glass polishing. Young Reeves, clearly itching to prove himself, drew his pistol with flourish. "Man learns things, huh? Learn anything about this?" He spun the gun around his finger, showing off. "Learn that's a good way to shoot yourself," Nate replied without looking up. The gang laughed, all except Blackwood, who studied Nate with growing interest. "You got a name, barkeep?" "Nate. Just Nate?" "Just Nate." Blackwood nodded slowly, then without warning swept his arm across the table, sending bottles and glasses crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Well, just Nate. You know what I think?" Blackwood rose, his voice turning ugly. "I think you're lying to me, and I don't like being lied to." Nate finally looked up, his face impassive. Bottle was $8. The Reed twins burst out laughing, but Blackwood silenced them with a look. He approached the bar slowly, like a wolf closing in on prey. $8? That's steep for rotgut whiskey." He reached into his coat and pulled out a coin, flicking it onto the bar. "Here's 2 bits. Buy yourself some manners." Nate looked at the coin, then back at Blackwood. "Still owe $7.75. "Clay," Blackwood said softly, "show our friend here what we do to mouthy bartenders." Thorne grinned and started forward, but at that moment, the doors swung open again. Marshal McAllister stood framed in the doorway, his badge catching the lamplight. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, calm as Sunday morning. "Might want to reconsider whatever you're thinking." "A marshal?" Blackwood's smile widened. "In this little dust heap? Must be our lucky day." "Way, I hear it," McAllister continued, stepping inside. "Cedar Ridge is missing a sheriff and some deputies. You boys wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Can't say that we do," Blackwood replied. "Though I did hear something interesting about Cedar Ridge. Heard their marshal was a coward. Ran and hid while good men died." His hand drifted toward his gun. "You're not a coward, are you, Marshal?" Everything happened at once. McAllister's hand dropped to his holster, but Blackwood was faster. The shot echoed like thunder in the confined space. McAllister stumbled backward, red blooming across his chest. "Bob?" Nate's voice cracked for the first time, genuine emotion breaking through his careful facade. "Stay. Behind the bar," McAllister gasped, then crumpled to the floor. Blackwood holstered his smoking gun. "Now, where were we?" "Ah, yes. Teaching some manners to our friend, the bartender. Clay Thorne moved forward again, cracking his knuckles. But this time, something had changed in Nate's demeanor. His hands had stopped their endless wiping motion. His shoulders had straightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes had taken on a look that made even Thorne hesitate. "Been a long time since I killed a man," Nate said softly, almost to himself. "Promised myself I was done with it." "Kill him," Blackwood ordered, annoyed by the delay. "Kill him slowly." Thorne reached across the bar to grab Nate's shirt, and that's when everything changed. Nate's hand moved faster than seemed humanly possible, catching Thorne's wrist and yanking him forward. There was a sharp crack as Thorne's face met the solid oak bar. He dropped like a stone, blood pooling beneath his broken nose. "Well, well," Blackwood drawled, though his hand had dropped back to his gun. "Looks like our quiet bartender has some fight in him after all." The Reed twins spread out, flanking the bar. Young Reeves bounced on his toes, eager for action. But Nate stood perfectly still now, his eyes fixed on McAllister's motionless form. "Last chance," he said, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't possessed before. "Take your friend and ride out. Don't make me break my promise." Blackwood's laugh was genuine this time. "Or what, you'll serve us to death?" He drew his gun with lightning speed. "I think it's time we—" The sound of a shotgun being racked cut through his words. Nate had produced the weapon from under the bar, its double barrels now pointed squarely at Blackwood's chest. "That's what you had in mind all along, wasn't it?" Blackwood's smile turned cold. "Hiding a scattergun under the bar? Problem is, old man, you can only kill one of us before the others cut you down." "True," Nate agreed. Then, with deliberate care, he set the shotgun on the bar. "That's why I won't be using it." His right hand dropped to his side where no gun had been visible moments before. But now somehow a well-worn Colt gleamed in his grip, as if it had materialized from thin air. "Been a while," Nate said softly, "since anyone called me the Prairie Shadow." The name fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of recognition across the faces of Blackwood's gang. Even Clay Thorne, still groggy from his encounter with the bar, stopped trying to stem his bleeding nose. "The Prairie Shadow?" young Reeves whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating. That's just a story. They say he died years ago." "Stories," Nate said quietly, his gun unwavering, "have a way of coming back to life." Blackwood's face had lost some of its color, but his arrogant smile remained fixed. "I heard of you. They say you killed 30 men in a single year. Say you could shoot a man's gun out of his hand at 50 paces. "If I'd killed that many," Nate replied, "I wouldn't have bothered counting." "Is so." The Reed twins exchanged glances, their synchronized movements betraying their nervousness. They had spread out too far, trying to flank the bar, and now found themselves exposed. "Boy," Nate addressed Reeves, without taking his eyes off Blackwood, "I'm going to give you a chance your friends won't get. You're young enough to learn from mistakes. Walk out now, leave your gun, and don't stop riding till you hit Mexico." Reeves looked uncertain at Blackwood, who spoke through clenched teeth. "You take one step toward that door, boy, and I'll kill you myself." Behind the bar, Nate shifted his weight slightly. The movement was almost imperceptible, but it caused all 5 men to flinch. "Last chance, kid, be smart." For a moment, the young gunslinger seemed to waver. Then his face hardened. "No one calls me kid." His hand dropped to his gun. What happened next was so fast it seemed like a single motion. Reeves drew, his gun clearing leather with impressive speed. But Nate was faster, impossibly faster. His first shot took Reeves's gun hand, spinning the weapon away in a spray of blood. His second caught the young man's shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. The Reed twins drew in perfect unison, their movements mirror images of each other. Nate's gun seemed to speak twice more without him even looking in their direction. Both twins stumbled backward, clutching their gun arms, their weapons clattering to the floor. "You've lost your edge, Shadow," Blackwood sneered, though sweat had broken out on his forehead. Time was. You'd have killed them all. Still might, Nate replied calmly. Depends on what happens next. Claythorne had managed to regain his feet, blood still streaming from his nose. His hand strayed toward his gun. I wouldn't, Nate warned. You're slower than the others, and I've got 1 bullet left. 1 bullet? Blackwood laughed, but there was a hysterical edge to it. Against the 2 of us? Those aren't good odds, old man. Better than you think. Nate's eyes flickered to McAllister's still form. Bob was more than just a marshal to me. He was there that day in Deadwood when I hung up my guns. Made me promise to stop killing. Made me swear I'd find another way. His voice grew softer. But he's dead now, and that promise died with him. A movement caught Nate's eye. Emma Hawthorne stood in the doorway, a rifle in her hands. She had returned, despite his warnings, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. She understood, stepping back into the shadows. Deadwood, Blackwood said slowly, recognition dawning. That's where you killed Mad Dog Matthews and his whole gang. 8 men, they say. 9, Nate corrected. People always forget about the lookout. And now you 10 bar. Thorne spat blood onto the floor. How the mighty have fallen. Man needs peace, Nate replied. I found mine here, until you brought war to my door. Outside, thunder rumbled, a storm approaching, or perhaps just the echo of the earlier gunfire. The wounded men groaned softly, but no one moved to help them. Way I see it, Blackwood said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone, we're at a stalemate. You're good, maybe the best there ever was, but you can't watch all of us at once. The minute you turn to shoot one, the other will put you down. True, Nate agreed. If I were still the man who needed to outdraw his enemies. He nodded toward the shotgun still lying on the bar. But I own a saloon now, and a saloon owner. Well, he likes to keep a few surprises under the bar. Blackwood's eyes widened as he spotted the thin wire running from behind the bar to the shotgun's trigger. Nate's boot was resting on something, a pedal, probably salvaged from an old piano. First man to draw, Nate explained quietly. Gets both barrels. Won't even need to aim. After that, he shrugged. Like you said. 1 bullet left. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the wounded had stopped their moaning, sensing the tension building toward its breaking point. You're bluffing, Thorne growled, but his hand had moved away from his gun. Maybe, Nate agreed. Question is, who wants to find out first? A drop of sweat rolled down Blackwood's temple. His fingers twitched near his gun, but he didn't draw. The legend of the prairie shadow had grown over the years, but the reality standing before them was somehow more terrifying than the stories. We could still work this out, Blackwood said, forcing a smile. Way I hear it, you used to ride with some pretty rough men yourself. Maybe we could... You killed my friend, Nate interrupted, his voice colder than anyone in the room had ever heard it. There's only one way this works out now. Behind them, Doc Green had silently entered through the back door and was checking McAllister's pulse. He caught Nate's eye and gave a slight nod. The marshal was alive. Barely. The knowledge seemed to change something in Nate's demeanor. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of finality. I've spent 5 years serving drinks to good men and bad, listening to their stories, watching their habits, learning how each man draws, how each man thinks. And you know what I learned? Neither Blackwood nor Thorne answered, but their eyes were fixed on his gun hand. I learned that the quiet ones, Nate's finger tightened imperceptibly on the trigger, are always the most dangerous. Thunder rolled outside as Doc Green worked frantically to save Marshal McAllister's life. The wounded Reed twins huddled in a corner, while young Reeves lay unconscious, his bleeding slowed by a makeshift tourniquet. The standoff between Nate, Blackwood, and Thorne had stretched into a deadly silence. You know, Blackwood said, his voice unnaturally calm, I heard another story about the prairie shadow. They say you disappeared after Deadwood because of a woman. That true? Something flickered in Nate's eyes, a shadow of old pain. You talk too much. Hit a nerve, did I? Blackwood's smile widened. They say she died. Say you weren't fast enough to save her. Jack, Thorne warned, seeing something change in Nate's expression. Sarah, Nate said softly, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. Her name was Sarah. Emma, still watching from the shadows near the door, saw Nate's hands tremble slightly, the first sign of emotion he had shown all night. Ah, so it is true, Blackwood pressed his advantage. The great prairie shadow brought low by a woman's death. Tell me, did she die quick, or? The shotgun roared, its double blast deafening in the confined space. Blackwood and Thorne dove in opposite directions as splinters exploded from the wall behind where they'd been standing. Nate's boot had pressed the pedal, but he hadn't aimed to kill, only to scatter them. That was your surprise under the bar, Blackwood laughed, rolling to his feet. Now what? Now, Nate said quietly. We do this the old way. His gun seemed to materialize in his hand again, but this time Blackwood was ready. Both men fired simultaneously. Nate's bullet took Blackwood's hat off, while Blackwood's shot creased Nate's shoulder, tearing his shirt and drawing blood. First blood to me, Blackwood grinned, but his smile faded as he saw Nate hadn't even flinched. You know why they called me the Prairie Shadow? Nate asked, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. Wasn't for the obvious reasons. Wasn't because I was quiet, or fast, or deadly. Though, I was all those things. He stepped out from behind the bar for the first time, his movements liquid smooth despite his wound. It was because of what Marshal McAllister taught me, back when he was just Deputy Bob, and I was just another angry kid with a fast gun. Shut up and fight, Blackwood snarled, but his voice shook slightly. Bob taught me that a man's shadow is always with him, but you only see it when there's light. Nate took another step forward. He taught me that every killer, every murderer, every man who thinks his gun makes him important, they all cast shadows too. And if you watch those shadows long enough... His gun barked once more, and Thorne screamed. His hidden derringer, half drawn from his boot, clattered across the floor. You can see what they're going to do before they do it. Impossible, Thorne gasped, clutching his bleeding hand. You couldn't have seen. 5 years, Nate continued, his eyes never leaving Blackwood. 5 years I've watched men draw their guns in this saloon. Watch their shoulders tense, their weight shift, their shadows move across the floor. 1,000 little tells that say when a man's about to kill. Fascinating lesson, Blackwood sneered, but he had gone pale. Why did you become a bartender? To study your prey? Number. For the first time, real emotion crept into Nate's voice. I became a bartender because Bob showed me there was more to life than killing. He taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by his speed with a gun or the notches on his belt. He taught me about peace. Peace? Blackwood laughed harshly. Peace is for cowards. Peace is for... Peace, Nate cut him off, is for men who've seen enough death to know its true cost. Bob taught me that. Sarah taught me that. And for 5 years, I lived it. Until now, Blackwood said softly. Until now, Nate agreed. Doc Green's voice cut through the tension. I've got the bleeding stopped, but he needs proper care, and soon. You hear that? Nate's voice hardened. The man you shot. The man who taught me everything I know about being human instead of just being a killer. He's still alive. Which means my promise to him still holds. Something like hope flickered across Blackwood's face. So you won't... But here's what Bob never understood. Nate continued, as if Blackwood hadn't spoken. Sometimes, a man has to break a promise to keep a bigger one. Sometimes, peace can only be protected by men willing to do violence. Thunder crashed again, closer now, and rain began to patter against the windows. In that moment, Emma saw the transformation complete. saw the quiet bartender she'd known for 5 years become something else entirely. The prairie shadow no longer seemed like just a legend. "I know what you're thinking," Nate said softly. "You're thinking that even if I am who I say I am, it's been 5 years. You're thinking maybe I've lost my edge, gotten soft serving drinks to cowboys and settlers." His gun disappeared into its holster, a holster that somehow seemed more visible now, as if it had always been there, waiting. "You're thinking," he continued, "that you're still faster than some washed-up legend, that the stories about me were just that, stories. Weren't they?" Blackwood's hand hovered near his gun. "No," Nate said simply. "They weren't stories. They were warnings." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark white. In that frozen moment, Emma saw them all like figures in a photograph. Blackwood coiled to strike, Thorne bleeding on the floor, the Reed twins huddled in their corner, Doc Green working desperately over McAllister's still form, and Nate. Nate stood like a man who had finally stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. The shadow had returned. "Last chance," he said quietly. "Surrender, face the law, live to see another sunrise." Blackwood's smile was terrible to behold. "You know I won't." "No," Nate agreed, his voice heavy with certainty. "You won't." The rain drummed against the saloon's windows, nature's own percussion for the deadly dance about to unfold. Lightning flickered again, and in its stark illumination, Nate's shadow stretched across the floor, long and dark, like the reputation that had followed him all these years. "Before this goes any further," Nate said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "there's something you should know about watching men die." Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly. "And what's that?" "It changes you every time. Each death leaves a mark that can't be washed away." Nate's eyes drifted to the wounded men around the room. "That's another thing Bob taught me. Why did he make me swear to find another way?" "Touching," Blackwood sneered, but his eyes betrayed his unease. "Is this how the great prairie shadow fights now? By talking his enemies to death?" "No," Nate replied calmly. "This is how he gives them a chance to live." His gaze swept the room. "All of you, listen carefully because these next few minutes will determine who walks out of here." Emma, still by the door, saw something she'd never witnessed before. Nate was teaching, just as Marshall McAllister had once taught him. But his lesson was painted in shades of survival and death. "Most men," Nate continued, "think gunfighting is about speed, about who can draw fastest, shoot straightest." He shook his head slowly. "But it's about reading, about knowing." As if to demonstrate, his hand moved like lightning, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. The bullet knocked Thorne's second hidden gun, this one from his sleeve, across the floor before the man could fully produce it. "Like knowing when a man's about to do something stupid," Nate added quietly. Thorne cursed, clutching his newly bleeding hand. The Reed twins pressed themselves further into their corner, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. "You've been watching us," Blackwood realized aloud. "All this time we've been talking, reading us, like you said." 5 years serving drinks," Nate nodded. "You learn to read men. The way they stand, the way they breathe, the way their eyes move." His voice took on an instructor's tone. "Like how your right foot turns out slightly before you draw, or how Thorne's left eye twitches when he's about to try something foolish." Blackwood's face darkened. "You think knowing our tells makes you invincible?" "No," Nate replied. "But it means I can do this." His gun disappeared into its holster again. He turned his back on Blackwood, walking to the bar with measured steps. Behind him, Blackwood's hand darted toward his gun. "I wouldn't," Nate said, without turning. "Your weight on your back foot. You'd miss it." Blackwood's hand froze, his face a mask of frustrated rage. "You're just guessing." "Am I?" Nate picked up a bottle, poured 2 glasses. "Your breathing changed, shortened. Your spurs clinked when you shifted your weight." The floorboard under your left boot creaked. He turned, holding both glasses. Little things. Things most men never notice. He set one glass at each end of the bar. But Bob noticed them. Taught me to notice them too. Turned me from a fast gun into something else entirely. A bartender? Blackwood spat. A student, Nate corrected. Every man who walked into this saloon taught me something. How bullies telegraph their punches, how liars blink too often, how killers. He looked directly at Blackwood. Can't keep their eyes off their target. As if to prove his point, Blackwood's gaze darted to Nate's gun hand, then back to his face. The Prairie Shadow, one of the Reed twins, whispered. They say he could shoot a man's gun hand at 50 paces in pitch darkness. Could, Nate agreed. Can. Because Bob taught me that in darkness you don't need to see, you listen, you feel, you know. To demonstrate, he closed his eyes. Right now, Thorne is trying to inch toward the shotgun on the floor. The Reed boys are thinking about making a break for the back door. And you, Blackwood. His eyes opened. You're wondering if you can get to that derringer in your vest before I can draw. The outlaw's face went pale. No one had seen the hidden gun. It was completely concealed by his vest. How? Blackwood started. The way your vest hangs, the slight bulge, the way you keep your left elbow tucked in. Nate's voice was almost gentle now. Details, always details. Doc Green spoke up from where he worked on McAllister. The marshal's stable, but his pulse is weak. He needs a doctor's office, proper tools. Nate nodded without taking his eyes off Blackwood. Then it's time to end this, one way or another. Your son and Hatch all of us at once, sir, Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. Don't need to. Already know what you're all going to do. Nate's voice hardened slightly. The twins will run. They're cowards at heart. Thorne will try something clever and get himself killed, and you. He paused. You'll go for your gun, because your pride won't let you do anything else. You're awfully sure of yourself, Blackwood growled. No, Nate corrected. I'm sure of you. Men like you, they're all the same. Think their reputation makes them special. Thinking about being feared makes them important. He shook his head slowly. But fear. Fear is just another tell. Another shadow to read. Lightning flashed again, and this time when the thunder rolled, it seemed to shake the very foundations of the saloon. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. Last chance, Nate said quietly. Because once this starts, all the lessons in the world won't help you. Once this starts, I stop being the bartender. Stop being a student. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I become what I was before. What Bob tried so hard to help me leave behind. And what's that? Blackwood asked, though his face suggested he already knew the answer. Nate's reply was simple, final. Death, walking. The moment shattered like a mirror-hitting stone. The Reed twins made their break for the back door, just as Nate had predicted. Thorne lunged for the fallen shotgun, his movements telegraphed seconds before he began. And Blackwood. Blackwood went for his hidden derringer with snake-like speed. But Nate was faster. He'd been faster 5 years ago, and time hadn't changed that truth. His first shot caught the back door's heavy wooden beam, dropping it into place just as the twins reached it. His second knocked the shotgun another foot away from Thorne's grasping fingers. And his third sent Blackwood's derringer spinning through the air in a spray of blood and splinters from the outlaw's vest pocket. All 3 shots had come so close together they sounded like a single, rolling thunderclap. Jesus Christ, one of the twins whispered. That's 3 bullets, Blackwood snarled, clutching his bleeding hand. How many you got left, Shadow? Enough, Nate replied simply. More than enough. But Emma, still watching from her position near the front door, saw something the others didn't, a slight tightening around Nate's eyes. He'd fired 3 shots in impossibly quick succession, and even legends had their limits. "You're not as fast as you used to be," Blackwood taunted, seemingly reading the same signs. "The old shadow would have killed us all by now." "Maybe," Nate agreed. "Or maybe Bob's lessons went deeper than you think." Thunder crashed outside as if emphasizing his words. The storm had reached its peak, rain hammering against the windows with renewed fury. In the dim light, shadows danced across the walls like restless spirits. "Your reputation," Blackwood continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone, "says you never miss, never waste a bullet. But you just used 3 shots, and we're all still breathing." "Wasn't trying to kill you," Nate replied. "Not yet." That brought Blackwood up short. "What?" "Giving you a chance to see what you're up against, to make the smart choice." Nate's eyes swept the room. "All of you. Because what happens next, that's on your heads, not mine." "President saker in Daveriker." Exchanged glances, then slowly raised their hands. "We surrender," one of them said. The kid was right. This ain't worth dying over. "Cowards." Blackwood spat, but Nate was already moving. With smooth efficiency, he pulled 2 pairs of handcuffs from behind the bar, where they'd hung next to the shotgun all these years, and slid them across the floor to the twins. "Put them on each other," he ordered. "Tight. I'll know if you don't." As the twins complied, Thorne made his move. He'd been inching toward a broken bottle, its jagged edge gleaming in the lamplight. But before he could grasp it, Nate's boot came down on his wrist. 5 years, Nate said softly, applying pressure until Thorne gasped in pain. 5 years I watched men like you plan desperate things. Saw it in their eyes, their hands, the way they looked at broken glass or empty bottles. He increased the pressure slightly. Amazing what a man learns tending bar. "You're enjoying this," Blackwood accused. "All that talk about peace, about Bob's lessons. You're loving every minute of being the shadow again." For the first time, something like doubt flickered across Nate's face. Emma saw it, and her heart clenched. Because Blackwood was right. There was a part of Nate that had awakened, a deadly part that moved with the fluid grace of a predator. "Maybe," Nate admitted quietly. "Maybe that's why Bob made me promise to stop, because he saw what I couldn't. How easy it is to become what you're fighting." "Then you're no better than us," Blackwood pressed his advantage. "Just another killer with a fancy name. Number." The word came not from Nate, but from Doc Green. The physician looked up from tending McAllister, his hands bloody but his eyes clear. "You're wrong about him. Dead wrong." "Doc," Nate warned. But Green continued. "I've watched this man serve drinks to saints and sinners alike for 5 years. Watched him break up fights with words instead of fists, help drunks home instead of letting them freeze, extend credit to families down on their luck." The doctor's voice grew stronger. "That's not a killer wearing a bartender's mask. That's a good man wearing the Shadow's gun." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with truth. Even Blackwood appeared momentarily at a loss. "Cuff him," Nate ordered Thorne, tossing another pair of handcuffs. "Behind his back, you try anything clever and I'll show you just how much of the shadow is still in me." Thorne, his wrist still aching from Nate's boot, complied with shaking hands. The Reed twins sat quietly in their corner, their own cuffs glinting in the lamplight. "You really think this ends with us behind bars?" Blackwood laughed as the cuffs clicked shut. "The minute word gets out that the Prairie Shadow is alive, every gunslinger from here to Texas will come looking for you. Your quiet life, your peace, it's over." "Maybe," Nate agreed. "But right now, all I care about is getting Bob to a doctor. The rest?" He shrugged. The rest is tomorrow's problem." "Then you're a fool," Blackwood sneered, "because tomorrow's problems have a way of showing up today." As if on cue, hoofbeats thundered outside the saloon. Many hoofbeats, growing louder by the second. "Ah," Blackwood's smile was terrible to behold. "Right on time." Nate's expression didn't change, but his grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his gun. "Emma," he called softly, "get Doc and Bob out the back. Now." "Nate." Emma started to protest, but he cut her off. "The rest of Blackwood's gang," he said quietly. "The ones who weren't with him in Cedar Ridge. The ones I should have known were coming." His eyes met hers. "Get them out, please." The hoofbeats stopped outside. Boot steps approached the saloon doors, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the metallic click of weapons being readied. "Well, Shadow," Blackwood's smile widened. "Still think you can read every man's intentions?" "No," Nate replied, moving to stand between the approaching footsteps and his wounded friend. "But I can read yours, and I know what's coming through that door isn't near as dangerous as what's already inside." Lightning flashed once more, and in its brilliant glare, the prairie shadow's silhouette seemed to grow, spreading across the floor like a promise, or a warning. The saloon doors creaked open slowly, deliberately. Through the gap came the gleam of gun barrels, 8, maybe 10 of them. The storm's fury painted everything in shades of shadow and lightning, turning the armed men into looming silhouettes. "Quite a reunion," the lead figure drawled, stepping into the light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from granite and eyes like chips of ice. The famous prairie shadow, tending bar in a dusty nowhere town. Almost didn't believe it when the boys rode out to tell us. "Wade Hawkins," Nate said quietly. "Still riding with trash, I see." "Still breathing," Wade corrected, his eyes taking in the scene. His captured companions, the wounded men, the growing pool of blood around Marshall McAllister. Which is more than I can say for some folks. More men filed in behind him, spreading out with practiced precision. Emma, still trying to help Doc Green move McAllister, counted 8 guns, all pointed at Nate. "Emma," Nate's voice was soft but carried an edge of steel. "Get Bob out. Now." "Nobody's going anywhere," Wade commanded. His men shifted to block both exits. "Not until we settle some old business." Blackwood, still handcuffed, laughed from his position on the floor. "Told you there'd be complications, Shadow. Wade's been running what's left of the Matthews gang since you killed the old mad dog." "Deadwood," Wade nodded. "Been a long time since anyone spoke that name. But some debts don't fade with time." Nate's gun hadn't moved, still trained on Blackwood, but his eyes scanned the room, reading angles, distances, shadows. "Your brother made his choice in Deadwood," he said to Wade. "Same as Mad Dog did." "My brother was 17. Wade's voice cracked like a whip. "Your brother was a killer," Nate corrected. "Same as you. Same as Mad Dog. He chose his path." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the hatred in Wade's eyes. "And you chose to gun him down, shot him in the back while he was running." Number Nate's denial was flat. Absolute. "I shot him in the front while he was drawing on a woman and her child. I saw his eyes when he died. He knew what he was doing. Just like you know what you're doing now." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Doc Green had managed to get McAllister into a sitting position against the wall, but the marshal's breathing was labored. 8 guns, Wade said softly. 8 experienced killers against 1 washed-up legend playing bartender. How do you like those odds, Shadow? Better than you'd think. Nate's voice remained steady. "Because I've been watching your men since they walked in. The one by the window, he's favoring his right leg. Old injury, probably. Slows his draw. The 2 by the bar are standing too close together. They'll get in each other's way. The one behind you is scared. His gun hand's shaking so bad he's likely to shoot one of his own." Wade's eyes narrowed. "You always talk too much." "Part of being a bartender," Nate replied. "You learn to read people, learn their habits, their fears. Like how your left eye twitches when you're about to draw, just like it did in Deadwood, just before your brother died. The words hit Wade like physical blows, his face contorted with rage. "Kill him," he roared. "Kill him now." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, yet was over in seconds. Nate moved like liquid shadow, his gun barking 3 times before anyone could react. The first shot took out the lamp above Wade's head, plunging half the room into darkness. The second caught the floorboard at the feet of the 2 men by the bar, sending them stumbling into each other. The third hit the window behind the injured gunman, making him duck instinctively. In the confusion, Nate rolled behind an overturned table as guns blazed. Bullets splintered wood and shattered bottles, filling the air with the smell of gunpowder and spilled whiskey. "Get Bob out!" Nate shouted to Emma over the chaos. "Doc, go with them!" Emma and Green half-carried, half-dragged McAllister toward the back door, as Wade's men tried to adjust to the darkness in their quarry's new position. "Spread out," Wade commanded. "He's just one man. One man who knows this room better than he knows himself." Nate's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. One man who spent 5 years memorizing every creak in these floorboards, every shadow cast by these lamps, every angle bullets can travel. A shot rang out, and one of Wade's men screamed, his gun hand suddenly useless. "One man," Nate continued, "who's had 5 years to prepare for exactly this kind of night." Another shot, another cry of pain. Wade's men were shooting at shadows now, at movements glimpsed in lightning flashes, at the ghost of a legend who seemed to be everywhere at once. "You're just proving what I always said," Wade shouted into the darkness. "You're a killer, Shadow. A cold-blooded murderer hiding behind fancy words and a bartender's apron." "No." Nate's voice was closer now. "I'm what Bob taught me to be. A man who chooses his battles. And right now, I'm choosing to give your men a chance to walk away." One of Wade's gunmen suddenly bolted for the door, then another. In the storm's flickering light, their fear was plain to see. "Cowards," Wade roared. "Stand and fight." "They're not cowards," Nate said quietly. "They're smart. They've figured out what you haven't, that there's a difference between being willing to kill and being willing to die." Only 3 of Wade's men remained now, plus Wade himself. Blackwood watched it all with a mixture of fury and fascination, his earlier bravado replaced by something like awe. "Come on, Shadow," Wade challenged, spinning in place, trying to locate his target. "Face me like a man, or are you just going to hide in the dark like the coward who shot my brother?" "I didn't hide then," Nate's voice came from directly behind him. "And I'm not hiding now." Wade whirled, his gun coming up, but he was far too late. The prairie shadow stood less than 3 feet away, his weapon already leveled. "Your brother died trying to murder innocents," Nate said softly. "Is that really the legacy you want to die for?" Lightning flashed one final time, illuminating them both in stark relief, Wade with hatred twisting his features, Nate with the calm certainty of a man who had made peace with violence long ago. And in the frozen moment, Wade's left eye twitched. The shot came not from Wade, but from behind. One of his remaining men had circled around in the chaos. Nate felt the bullet tear through his left shoulder, spinning him sideways. His own shot at Wade went wide, shattering a mirror behind the bar. "Not so legendary now, are you?" Wade laughed, regaining his confidence as Nate stumbled against a table. The great prairie shadow, bleeding like any other man. Nate's gun hand stayed steady, but blood darkened his shirt at an alarming rate. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was bad enough to matter. To slow him down. To make him human. "Emma!" he shouted, hearing movement near the back door. "I told you to get out." "Not without you," she called back, and he heard the distinctive sound of her rifle being cocked. "Don't," he warned. But it was too late. Emma's shot caught one of Wade's remaining men in the leg, dropping him. But the muzzle flash gave away her position, and Wade's other man was already turning, his gun rising. Nate didn't hesitate. He threw himself across the room, his injured shoulder screaming in protest, and tackled Emma as the outlaw's bullet whistled through the space where she had been. They crashed behind the bar together as bottles exploded overhead. Touching, Wade's voice dripped with mockery. The shadow does have a heart after all, makes me wonder. A pause then. Bring the marshal back in here. Nate's blood ran cold as he heard the sounds of struggle. One of Wade's men must have circled around outside. He had Doc Green at gunpoint, forcing him and McAllister back through the door. Let them go, Nate called out, his voice steady despite the pain. This is between us. No, Wade replied. This is about family, about watching the ones you love die, just like I had to watch my brother die. The great prairie shadow brought low by the same weakness that retired him in the first place. You care too much. Emma tried to rise, but Nate held her down as more bullets splintered the bar above them. Stay still, he whispered. Please. You can't save them all, Shadow, Wade shouted. Just like you couldn't save that woman in Deadwood. What was her name? Sarah? The name hit Nate like a physical blow. 5 years of peace, of trying to forget, crashed down around him. He saw Sarah's face, heard her last words, felt her blood on his hands all over again. That's right, Wade pressed his advantage. The boys told me all about her, how you tried to leave life behind for her, how Mad Dog's gang found you anyway, how you weren't fast enough to save her. Don't. Nate's voice was barely a whisper. And now history repeats itself. Wade's boots creaked on the floorboards as he moved closer. The marshal who tried to save your soul, the woman who gave you a chance at a new life, the doctor who kept your secrets. Which one should die first? Emma's hand found Nate's in the darkness behind the bar. Whatever happens, she whispered. You gave us 5 years of peace. That's worth something. But Nate barely heard her. His mind was racing backward through time, to that night in Deadwood when it had all gone wrong, when he'd been too confident, too sure of himself, too convinced that his reputation would keep Sarah safe. I can't, he started, his voice cracking. Can't what? Wade taunted. Can't save them? Can't bear to watch them die? Or can't admit that everything Bob taught you about peace was a lie? The storm outside had begun to fade, the thunder growing more distant. In the relative quiet, Nate could hear McAllister's labored breathing, Doc Green's attempts to keep him steady, Emma's heart pounding next to him. You know what your problem is, Shadow? Wade continued. You never understood what this life really means. It's not about being the fastest or the deadliest. It's about being willing to do whatever it takes, to sacrifice anyone and anything to win. Nate closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his gun, the burn of his wound, the tremor in his hands that came not from fear but from something deeper, the knowledge that whatever he did next would define him forever. You're right, he said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the smoky air. I do care too much. Always have. He squeezed Emma's hand once, then let go. That's what Bob saw in me all those years ago. Not just a fast gun, but a man who could feel the weight of every trigger pull, every life taken. Philosophy won't save them, Wade sneered. No, Nate agreed, but it might save you. He raised his voice. All of you, listen carefully. In about 10 seconds, I'm going to stand up. I'm going to drop my gun, and then you're going to have a choice. The only choice, Wade laughed, is which one dies first. Wrong. Nate's voice had changed, becoming something ancient and terrible. The choice is whether you want to be the men who killed an injured marshal, a doctor trying to save lives, and an innocent woman, or the men who walked away and lived to tell about it. You're in no position to make threats, Wade said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. Not a threat, Nate replied. A prophecy, because if you harm any of them, if you spill one more drop of innocent blood in this saloon. He took a deep breath. Then the prairie shadow stops trying to save your lives and goes back to what he does best. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wounded had stopped their moaning, sensing something momentous about to unfold. You're bluffing, Wade said finally, but his voice shook slightly. Am I? Nate asked softly. You've heard the stories. You know what I was. What I can be again. So ask yourself, do you really want to force that choice? Do you want to be the one who brings death back to life? Emma felt him shifting beside her, preparing to rise. Nate, she whispered, don't. But he was already standing, his gun held loosely at his side. Blood dripped steadily from his wounded shoulder, but his eyes were what held everyone transfixed. They were no longer the eyes of a bartender, or even of a legendary gunfighter. They were the eyes of a man looking into an abyss and choosing to step forward anyway. Time seemed to crystallize in the smoke-filled saloon. Nate stood exposed, his gun pointed at the floor, blood darkening his left sleeve. Wade and his remaining men held their positions, weapons trained on their various hostages. Even the storm outside had hushed, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "Drop the gun," Wade ordered, but his voice trembled slightly. Nate's weapon hit the floor with a sound like distant thunder. The clatter echoed through the room, emphasized by the absolute silence that followed. "There," Nate said quietly. "Now you have what you wanted." The prairie shadow, unarmed and bleeding. His eyes found Wade's across the room. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "Kill him," Blackwood called from his position on the floor, still handcuffed. "Kill him now before he tries something." But Wade hesitated, and in that hesitation Nate saw something he recognized. The same doubt he'd felt in Deadwood, the moment before everything changed. "Your brother had that same look," Nate said softly. "Right before he made his choice. Right before he decided that killing was easier than living with doubt." "Shut up." Wade's gun wavered slightly. "You don't get to talk about him." "I remember every man I've killed," Nate continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Every face, every moment, your brother's eyes were green like your mother's. He told me that, right before he drew. Said it was the only good thing he got from her." Wade's face went pale. How did you?" "Because I listened," Nate replied simply. "That's what Bob taught me. That every man, even the ones you have to kill, deserves to be heard, to be remembered." "Boss," one of Wade's remaining men called nervously, "something ain't right here." 5 years, Nate went on, taking a small step forward. 5 years I've poured drinks and listened to stories, learned that every man who walks through those doors is carrying something. Pain, fear, regret. Another step. Even you, Wade. Especially you. Stay back. Wade's gun tracked Nate's movement, but his hand was shaking now. "You know what I learned most of all?" Nate's voice dropped lower, becoming almost gentle. "I learned that the man who needs everyone to fear him is usually the most frightened of all." At that moment, several things happened at once. Doc Green, seeing Wade's attention fixed on Nate, shifted his weight to shield the wounded marshal. Emma's hand found the butt of her fallen rifle beneath the bar, and the last of Wade's loyal men began backing toward the door. "Now!" Wade shouted, but his men didn't move. They had seen something in Nate's eyes that scared them more than their leader's wrath. "They're not going to shoot," Nate said with quiet certainty, "because they finally understand what Bob taught me years ago, that there's a difference between being a killer and being a murderer. They'll shoot if I tell them to shoot." Wade's voice rose to a desperate pitch. "No," Nate shook his head slowly. "They won't. Because they can feel it. What's coming? What happens if they cross that line?" He took another step forward. "You feel it too, don't you, Wade? That voice in your head telling you this isn't what your brother would have wanted? You don't know what he wanted." Wade's finger tightened on the trigger. "You killed him." "He forced my hand," Nate corrected gently, "just like you're trying to force it now. But ask yourself, is this really about your brother? Or is it about you trying to live up to a legacy of violence that never brought anyone peace?" Wade's gun barrel dipped slightly, uncertainty warring with rage on his face. Behind him, his last 2 men exchanged glances and began moving slowly toward the exit. "You can still walk away," Nate continued, close enough now that Wade's gun nearly touched his chest. Can still choose a different path. That's what Bob taught me, that it's never too late to change. Boss, one of the remaining outlaws called from the doorway. We're leaving. This ain't worth dying for. Cowards. Wade's shout was ragged. All of you. The Great Prairie Shadow is right in front of us unarmed, and you're running? No. Nate's voice was barely a whisper now. They're not running. They're living. Something your brother never got the chance to learn. Wade's gun pressed against Nate's chest right over his heart. I could kill you right now. End the legend once and for all. Could, Nate agreed. But you won't, because you've finally figured out what I learned 5 years ago, that pulling a trigger is easy. Living with it afterward. That's the hard part. For a long moment, the only sound was the fading storm and Wade's ragged breathing. Then, slowly, incredibly, his gun barrel began to lower. What are you doing? Blackwood demanded from the floor. Kill him. Kill all of them. But Wade wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on Nate's, seeing perhaps for the first time what his brother had seen in those final moments. Not a legend, not a killer, but a man who carried the weight of every life he'd taken. My brother, Wade said hoarsely. He really did draw first? Yes, Nate replied softly. And his last words were about you. About hoping you'd choose a better path. The gun slipped from Wade's fingers, hitting the floor with a finality that seemed to echo through the years. Behind him, his last men melted away into the night, leaving only the sound of distant hoofbeats. It's over, Nate said quietly, not just to Wade, but to everyone in the room. The killing stops here. Emma emerged from behind the bar, her rifle trained on Wade, but her eyes on Nate. Doc Green resumed tending to McAllister, whose breathing had steadied. And outside, the storm finally broke, moonlight streaming through the windows to paint silver paths across the bullet-scarred floor. Wade sank to his knees, years of hatred and vengeance draining from him like blood from a wound. What? What happens now? Nate's reply was interrupted by a weak voice from the corner. Now, Marshal McAllister said, struggling to sit up, we all learn to live with our choices, just like I taught him to do all those years ago. The Prairie Shadow looked at his old friend, then at the woman who had given him a chance at a new life, then finally at the man who had come to kill him but found redemption instead. No, he corrected gently. Now we learn to live with our choices together. Dawn broke over Whisper Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. The Silver Star Saloon bore the scars of the night's violence, bullet holes in the walls, broken glass glinting on the floor, bloodstains that would never quite wash away. But it still stood, much like the man who had defended it. Nate worked methodically behind the bar, his left arm in a sling, cleaning glasses just as he had done every morning for the past 5 years. The routine was the same, but something had changed, not just in him, but in the very air of the place. You don't have to do that now, Emma said softly, watching him from the doorway. Doc Green said you need rest. Rest can wait, Nate replied, not looking up. Some things need to be put right first. Through the window, they could see Marshal McAllister being tended to in Doc Green's office across the street. The lawman would live, though he'd carry another scar to add to his collection. In the jail next door, Wade and his surviving men sat quietly in their cells, their fighting spirits broken not by violence, but by understanding. Word's already spreading, Emma continued, moving to help him despite his protests. About what happened here, about who you really are. Who I was, Nate corrected gently. The Prairie Shadow died last night, along with a lot of old ghosts. Did he? Emma's voice carried a hint of doubt. Those men who ran, they'll talk. More will come, looking to make a name for themselves. Nate finally stopped his work, looking at her directly. Let them come. They'll find what those before them found, just a bartender who listens more than he shoots. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, the new lines around his eyes. He looked both older and younger somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted, even as a new one settled in its place. "You're really going to stay?" Emma asked, hope warring with concern in her voice. "Even after all this?" "5 years ago," Nate said slowly, "Bob McAllister found me in Deadwood, drowning in guilt and whiskey after Sarah's death. He could have drawn on me, tried to bring in what was left of the prairie shadow. Instead, he sat down and ordered a drink, talked to me about peace, about choices, about the difference between living and just surviving." He touched the scar on his shoulder, still fresh and painful. "Last night, I finally understood what he was trying to teach me. It's not about hanging up your guns or pretending the past never happened. It's about choosing who you want to be every single day." The door creaked open, and old Walt shuffled in, right on time for his morning drink. He paused, taking in the destruction, then smiled toothless. "Heard there was some excitement last night," he said, settling onto his usual stool. "Sorry I missed it." Nate's lips twitched in what might have been a smile as he poured the old man his usual. Some things at least hadn't changed. "Town's already talking about rebuilding," Emma said, watching Walt take his first sip. "Marshal McAllister says he'll recommend a commendation for how you handled things. Without killing anyone, I mean. Bob always did believe in redemption." Nate nodded. "Even for men like Wade. Maybe especially for men like Wade." Through the window, they could see people beginning to emerge from their homes, life returning to Whisper Valley. Children played in the street, women hung laundry, men nodded respectfully as they passed the saloon. But there was something different in how they looked at the Silver Star now. Not fear, exactly, but awareness. Understanding. "You know," Emma said thoughtfully, "I always wondered why you chose this place. Why here, of all the towns you could have disappeared to?" Nate was quiet for a long moment, his hands moving automatically through their familiar routine. "Because it was quiet," he said finally. "Because it needed someone to tend the bar and listen to stories. Because—" He paused, looking around at the bullet-scarred walls, the broken bottles, the first rays of sun painting everything in new light. Because some places, like some people, deserve a second chance. The door opened again, and Doc Green entered, looking exhausted but satisfied. "Marshall's going to make it," he announced. "Says he wants to talk to you, Nate, about the future." "Future's right here," Nate replied, gesturing to the saloon around them. Always was. As if to emphasize his point, he reached up and removed the shotgun from its hiding place behind the bar. Everyone watched as he unloaded it, then placed it carefully in a box with his gun belt. "Won't you need those?" Emma asked softly. "If others come looking for the shadow?" "No." Nate shook his head. "Because they won't find him. They'll find what Wade and his men found. Something a lot more dangerous than a fast gun." "And what's that?" Doc Green asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "A man at peace with his past," Nate replied, returning to his endless task of polishing glasses. "A man who learned that the hardest battles are won with words instead of bullets. A man who finally understood what Bob was trying to teach him all along." "Which is?" Emma pressed. Nate looked up, and in his eyes they saw not the deadly gunfighter of legend, not the quiet bartender of the past 5 years, but something new. Something that combined the strength of one with the wisdom of the other. "That true courage isn't about being faster than the other man's bullet," he said softly. "It's about being strong enough to offer him a drink instead." Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night. Whisper Valley stirred to life around them, forever changed, but somehow stronger for it. And in the Silver Star Saloon, a bartender who had once been a legend continued his work, one glass at a time, at peace with who he had been and who he had chosen to become. The prairie shadow was gone, but something better had taken his place. A man who had learned that the greatest victories are won not with a gun, but with understanding. A man who had finally found his true calling, not in dealing death, but in pouring hope, one drink at a time, in a dusty saloon where legends could rest and ordinary men could find redemption. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.